Hello and welcome to the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything fantasy and science fiction. Your host is Matt Crosswhite, and the subject matter expert is Josiah Marshall. And here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Crosswhite, joined by subject matter expert Josiah Marshall. How are you, sir?
Doing excellent. Doing really quite well, all considering, despite the normal the normal hurdles of life,
Yes.
as
Yep.
any parent can attest to.
I saw a video one time of the caption was "How I'm doing today," and it was somebody on a track at a high school or something. And instead of going over the hurdles, they're just plowing into them and dragging them along one by one and getting slower and slower the more hurdles they encounter. Sometimes it feels that way.
That's cool. Yeah, I would agree. That sounds very appropriate.
So today you have a specific book for us.
I do. So, one of the things I enjoyed doing a lot during my time as a bookstore owner, but even not only that, just even in working in libraries and bookstores, was finding those hidden gems, finding those authors that not a whole lot of people know about, but that can be really good, and not even just little known, but even just authors from other countries, international authors. And
Okay.
but when it came to a lot of parents coming to me and asking, do you know of any Christian fantasy that would meet our kids' interests and still be able to sort of invoke something of a Christian ideology or philosophy or theology? Could you point us in the direction of someone that's, for example, interested in a young girl who's into dragons, or a young boy who's into something along King Arthur or knights? And I actually have answers for both those. One of them, the first one, was actually the Dragon Keeper by Danita K. Paul, her entire series. And then the second one is Chuck Black. Oh man, the series name just escaped me, but it's about a knight. And so those are two authors I immediately used to recommend for people. But when it came to one area especially, epic fantasy, or there's other ways, that a lot of different ways people have phrased epic fantasy as either high fantasy or comprehensive fantasy, something along those lines. It's where you get into a story and it's got incredible detail to it. So it's the difference of looking at, say, a perhaps a masterpiece, not to compare it to these actual painters, but looking at the Mona Lisa versus looking at maybe, say, a 10th grade attempt to paint the Mona Lisa. So
Gotcha. Okay. Or Matt's attempt to paint the Mona Lisa.
There you go. Yeah, my attempt even. Good grief. Oh my. And it's almost the difference between reading a child's book and reading an encyclopedia. Because as we know with Tolkien, he goes into tremendous detail, tremendous backstory, history, language, culture. All of this is what we find in epic fantasy. And a lot of people that I met were so encaptured by it, but yet some of the parents were a little concerned with some of the elements coming into these stories that they just didn't want their kids reading, which is, it's fine.
So can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
When describing epic fantasy, and you brought up the level of detail that Tolkien wrote with, it almost sounds like, to some, it might almost be inaccessible. That's why the Lord of the Rings movies were so good, because it brought a lot of a lot of people into familiarity with Tolkien that otherwise would not have, because they maybe wouldn't pick up something like that. Is that an element of epic
Mm.
fantasy, or is that a false takeaway?
No, that is definitely there. I've actually had some clients who come to me saying, "I want to be able to get into this, but I'm struggling with it."
Mm,
Because when you look at it from when you look at high fantasy from, say, the perspective of, like I do with my background linguistics, you look at it as immersion. You're trying to throw
sure,
yourself into a different world and in a different place. And so when you get into the fantasy area, that can be a struggle for some, especially for some
sure.
who are more akin to reading narrative realism. So if you were to take Tolkien and compare it to, say, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels,
Hmm.
Jonathan Swift used narrative realism. He brought in very realistic elements of life that were going on during his time frame, such as when he goes into the giant land and he finds he's now the small guy, but he's
Mm.
using these as an allegorical, metaphorical comparison with what the social casting was and social ranking was during his time, especially in England and in that part of the world. So there was different social stratas involved, and then
Okay.
and you can see this. There's three different Gulliver Travels worlds, and so you can see that happening in each of those different worlds. Whereas
Okay.
with now there can be argued some narrative realism, but it wouldn't. I don't think it'd be necessarily narrative realism as much as thematic or topical realism when it comes to Tolkien, because Tolkien does bring in these elements of hope and despair. These are very real things that
Sure.
we experience on a daily basis. He also brings in very real personalities that we could meet anywhere along the road of life, and even it's not quite from the book. This Peter Jackson kind of embellished it a little bit. But when Samwise Gamgee starts talking about, well, what if we're in a story? What are people going to read? What part are we going to
Mm.
play? Um, that's I've actually had that conversation with other people's. So there is these topical and thematic realisms that are definitely part of Tolkien, but there is still that otherworldliness to it that a lot of people find it difficult to engage with, and I guess it could be established on some sort of psychological, emotional, or even relational spectrum of some kind. But overall, in my opinion, it's different ways of how people see life and how they engage with the life around them that can influence why they want to get into fantasy, and specifically epic fantasy. Now, one of the go-tos, and almost a cliche at this point, is that epic fantasy provides an outlet for persons who are misunderstood, abused, bullied,
Mm.
have a very difficult or traumatic childhood, or just different traumatic experiences in their lives. And so epic
Sure.
fantasy ends up providing them an outlet by which they can escape what they're experiencing and feeling now to a place where they can be different and they can
Because
find
that
themselves.
place is so dramatically different from their current world. It's not
Yeah.
just a little bit off, like Gulliver's Travels, where someone's bigger than us now. It's so
Hmm.
dramatically different that it's a true escape.
Yes.
That that makes sense. Okay, so the book you're going to tell us about today is in the genre of epic fantasy.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of funny. I almost got um, almost off topic there completely. So thank you for bringing me back.
Sure.
Um, because epic fantasy had some phenomenal establishments by some great authors during especially the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because after World
Mm,
War II is when we really see that taking place. Tolkien kicked off. Oh, good grief! That guy, he really kicked it. He kicked that bucket, and it created a whole new no whole new literary grouping. So we've got a lot of these, but apparently, when it comes to epic fantasy within what would be established as a Christian realm or Christian publishing, it's harder to come by. Now you do have a couple of guys that Stephen Lawhead. He's got a couple that you really allow. He gets you immersed into it through a long series. He also has a two-part series, which is science fiction, which we've talked about, and so you can kind of get immersed into that a bit. But when you're looking at a
Sure.
traditional, what you think of epic fantasy, you've got places that you're having to be introduced to almost not only a different way of thinking, but a different way of life, so to speak, but yet that still has some connections to our own life. And
Sure.
so the author that I found a number of years ago actually is a F.W. Fowler. And he wrote a book called A Sword in the Immerland. A Sword for the Immerland King, excuse me. I'll get there. A Sword for the Immerland King. And I would put it almost to epic fantasy. Almost. There are certain elements of epic fantasy that he incorporates, such as language. He has his own built language, poetry, song, various cultural specifics that's completely identified with this world. An entire system that you have to be introduced to, but it's not a system that's specifically unique to this world. It's heavily built into ours. It's medieval. It's got king. It's got blacksmith. It's got all of the things that you would see that's part of that medieval setting. And so
Okay.
it's just this side of epic, but I would put it up there near that because it allows you to jump into something that's a bit more immersive. So I'm going to read the description of the book, the little capture of it. It is a big book, and so when it also comes to epic, I should also add that epic also usually is anywhere from 300 plus or 300, right around there, or plus at least.
Okay. Now
But
this one is
even
a
then,
standalone book or is it part of a series?
it is actually the start of a series.
Okay.
It is the start of a series, but being the first book tends to set a tone, tends to set a
Sure.
rhythm, so it plays a big role. That's why when you say go to a thrift store and you're looking for new books, you most likely will not find the first book of a series
Right.
because that's what people really end up connecting with. And so the rest of the series, it's a hit or miss. But this is the beginning of a series. And this book specifically is about in the portals of Thessalindria collection, a different place, a familiar struggle, a king controlled by his hatred, a daughter searching for her place, a blacksmith with deep conviction, a mountain prince who yearns for peace, a sword that divides and unites, a decision that brings pain yet heals hurts, the forging of the sword for the Immerland King. All of Thessalindrian history will be affected by the making of this sword. Ma Eladra and their messengers and prophets offer spiritual understanding and guidance that is beyond natural knowing and is unfolded on this journey into heart, soul, time, and the infinite. Immerland is a small country in the northern reaches of Laura, one of 3 continents on the world of Thessalindria. A sword for the Immerland King gives the first glimpse into this world from the outside with the story of the epic conflict between a king and a blacksmith at odds over the king's demand for a sword for his 50th birthday.
Wow.
So, does that sound interesting to you?
It does. It absolutely does. And my brain tries to put it in categories. Like it might be like this or it might be like that, but it also sounds very unique in its own right. And yeah, that sounds like a book I'd love to pick up.
One of the first things I noticed was the tension. He started off with some fabulous tension and mystery as well. You've got characters, you're getting to know them. He doesn't. One of the things one of my pet peeves is when an author just gets so giving that the person will ask a question and you'll get the full answer, right?
Yeah.
You give a
Yeah.
partial answer, that way it can create more questions, and you give it in such a cryptic way, perhaps, that it will continue to capture the interest of the reader and keep them moving through the book,
Yeah,
right?
you got to create some mystery.
Yeah. So he started off with some fabulous tension. And I say starts off because he went into my pet peeve.
Oh, I see.
Halfway through the book, the king shows up in the blacksmith who he has imprisoned in a tower in his castle, and he just asks him a question. Then all of a sudden, the blacksmith is just spilling the beans. Come on, really? You had some great dialogue going. The tension was perfect. I mean, really, very, very well done. So one of the things I did like about this book was that it was very well edited. The tone was even, a very even tone. And the language was quite consistent. You didn't see him fluttering between high language or low language or highfalutin or non-falutin. So it was really quite evenly done. The pacing, though, it took a bit because some of the chapters were a little longer, some of them were shorter, to the point of one chapter was about 10 pages. Another chapter was a single page and it wasn't even a full page. You know,
Okay. I've read some
okay,
books like that.
yeah. But one of the things I factored in before I started reading this book was him trying to establish of saying this is a historical account. We're trying to
Mm.
look at the history of this world. Okay, so you're doing more of a historical narrative. And as a result, things are going to be inconsistent as far as pacing. Some authors might be a little bit more giving, some might be a little less giving in what they're trying to talk about and the information that they're giving out. So sources can be inconsistent in that way. So I can appreciate where he went there. But at the same time, it just caused me, it felt like a car lurching. Like I was in with a new driver learning how to drive a car and it just
But is
back and
that
forth.
is that sometimes a technique that authors will use to create a different type of suspense, though?
Yes, yes, it has been a technique, but in my opinion, and a lot of the reviewers that I've read and actually quite agree with, is that it's not a good one. You want to limit
Understood.
that as much as possible because for the average reader, you really want to be able to give them something that they can pace themselves with. And if you cause a lot of lurching or disruption, especially when you've got a certain template in place that you've got, okay, so I can expect chapters to be anywhere from 8 to 10 pages each, then you've set a pacing for the reader that they can expect. So when you start throwing in a one-page chapter, it's like, okay. Now, um, there are reasons for putting that in sometimes because when you've got a long chapter, just having a short chapter can help give the reader some breathing room and allow them
Hmm.
to kind of slow down the pace just a bit. But at the same
Sure.
time, it has that potential of causing that lurching effect. And it can completely disengage. It would disengage me. It disengaged me a number of times to where even just after
Mm.
reading for 10 minutes, I put the book down. But then I'd
Oh
pick it back
wow.
up. And it'd have to just
Because
be a day or two later.
it was good enough to the other elements of it were so good that it allowed you to overcome that lurching
Mm-hmm.
aspect. Okay.
There was still enough questions that after he lost the tension, there was still enough to keep me going, especially when I've still got questions such as the gatekeeper. That one was kind of fun, especially with the little twist he had on him. He didn't really get into a depth of him, but I liked how he kept adding in one sentence of just mystery. He'd have his narrative, and then in a paragraph, he'd just add one sentence, and that's usually all that it's needed in order to establish some sort of tension or even mystery. More so mystery, I would say. It's usually the lack of words that's going to create that tension or certain type of phrasing that'll do that. But Overall, what I also find, especially more with Christian epic authors, is that the primary character tends to reflect themselves even more than the average author. Because the average author knows, okay, some element of me is going to end up in the main character. That's just a
Sure.
given. But I have found that with Christian authors, they tend to be a little bit more on the nose about it. So this guy, one of his interests is blacksmithing, and he's been doing it for a number of years. His main character is a blacksmith.
Okay.
Now, that can aid, don't get me wrong, that can actually aid in developing and helping somebody really connect with that type of world, because here's a guy who's had a lot of experience in a smithy, and so he can give you more language and more vocabulary and more way of being able to see this and that than just the average person walking into a smithy and going, oh, there's
Sure.
that involved. It's a little bit more platonic in that way. But when you go with the other way, it's a lot more intimate. It's a lot more deeper. It's more significant to what the smithy is doing, why he's doing it, and so forth. Now, one of the things I really enjoyed about it was that he created a type of language for the smithy. Now, smithy, and just in general, just the overall historical factors of smithies, is that they tend to have a poetic rhythm to it. And so when they're got a steady pace going, you've got timing, then you've usually got some smithies that will start doing either vocal poetry or vocal singing, or they'll keep it quiet and they're doing it in their head. He takes it to another degree of actually incorporating some spiritual aspects into it. Where is the language coming from? Where is the poetry coming from? Is it something that you've learned, or is it something that just comes to your mind as you're working? And he really touched on the wisdom
Hmm.
of the city and how it can reflect certain elements of life. Because he even at one point had the king going, wait a minute, how is this smithy so knowledgeable about things? Why is it that
Nice.
when we go and sit and talk to this smithy, that I feel like I'm the student and he's the teacher?
Hmm.
Sort of thing. You go, oh, okay. That's an interesting way of putting it. But so while there is definitely that philosophy that goes on through the story, I would say that there is some decent pacing for the action. There are definitely things that keep going on. He does end up trading perspectives throughout the story between various characters, such as the king, the smithy's son, the king's daughter, and then also the villain, so to quote unquote, and the
Hmm.
villain's son. Now, one of the other pet peeves I have is when characters, not only do they have pretty just plain straightforward dialogue, there's no personality behind it. But then when also all the characters are, how would I connect this? It would be similar to the Hallmark movies,
I got you.
because in
They're
Hallmark movies,
they're all following
everybody's
the same script.
not only are they all following the same script, but they're also all following the same sort of attitude, the same sort of
Hmm.
social mannerisms, the social.
Same
So
stereotypings.
yes, exactly. Now that's not to say his characters don't get emotional. They get emotional, but there is still, especially between some of the characters, there's still this just lack of even just uh, action tension as well. So when you lose that, it's just like, what am I reading here? It doesn't really add much to it at all. It really takes away if it's just so bland and plain like that. But still, he kept enough emotion in it to where you got the king getting angrier and more paranoid. You've got the villain, quote unquote, going through his own process of things. But then he starts incorporating more mysterious characters, which was good. Um, but then there were some that were a little on the nose, especially when it comes to a donkey. Um, so when the smithy starts singing in this original language, it's everybody in the kingdom can actually hear him, and stops and listens. Some can understand some of it, some can understand all of it, some can understand none of it. But not only does it stop people, it stops animals. And so at one point, he's got the smithy kid protecting a donkey who's trying to listen to the singing from an owner who's whipping the donkey and trying to get it moving onward. And so knowing that there's this Christian background in the story and how it's definitely Christian, there's a framework there. You just start seeing the correlations between that and scripture. You go, okay, I think I know what's going to happen here with that animal.
I see.
That's why I just call it so on the nose for biblical
Sure.
incorporation and the source for a lot of imaginative creatures and ways of how those creatures work. Just you can just see the biblical framework at work, but biblical influence, I should say, at work. But I'm not going to give too much away. I would say it's definitely enjoyable to read. I would put it. I actually rated it a 3 out of 5 because it lost that tension. It lost that tension. It had the characters being a little bland. It's just how they interacted and associated with one another. But overall, I liked clarity. He had some decent clarity, and because sometimes, for example, what's her name, Sherwood Smith, the way she writes sometimes. She wrote a book called Inda. Some of her language, she ends up throwing so much into one paragraph. You lose your picture of where the character's standing, how they're associated, where in the setting with everything else and everyone else. So that's one of the things I actually appreciated about him, was that his clarity was good and his description was good enough to where you felt some sort of bonding or connection with some of these places. There is a character who lives on this land that the way he describes this land, you want to be there. So that's definitely positive. Okay, great. Let's go there. Let's do this. So yes, there are the cliches. It is about a sword. You hear that in a lot of fantasy. It's just really, can we move beyond the sword? But
Yeah, you don't hear as much epic fantasy written about the lost mace of somewhere or someone's lance. It's always
well,
about a sword.
it is. It is. It really is. And there's a whole big conversation about that, about whether it's cultural, religious, or just history. There's all sorts of interesting connections with that. But suffice it to say, um, what I liked about this one, though, was that the swords ended up taking on something of a personality of their own because there was so much tension going into making the swords.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
I'll give that one to him. I'll give that one to him. Now, while there are no direct uh, interactions with fanciful creatures, they are mentioned throughout the book in smatterings. So you get the idea of, okay, there's dwarves, there's other fanciful creatures in this world, but it's really focused on the interaction between the king and the smithy and the history that the king, the smithy, and this villain have in common. So there is that part there. But as I said, I give it a 3 out of 5. Go check it out. I think that this is definitely an excellent addition to just the history and the heritage that we have in Christian fantasy, just in general, because it's going to
Okay.
give some unique thinking and unique language to how we process things. And it can
Mm.
also help bring in more of that. So if somebody struggles with reading such as Piercing the Darkness by Frank Peretti, I'm giving a hint
Yep.
here, then you might read this one because it could give you a different way of looking at things. So
Okay.
I'm going to make that connection and leave it there. Um,
Talking about answering questions while building suspense.
but this book actually was out of print for a number of years. I think it was
Hmm.
about 10 years or so. And then the author, I think, got the copyright back. So it's been republished. It's been quote unquote re-released. Um, and it is now, it was republished in 2022, and I believe he did some editing on that book. I have the original. I have the first edition. So he did preserve it, but he tried to strengthen the voice and reduce the length in the newer version.
Okay.
So what would be technically considered either abridged, it may even be author's preferred edition. I'm not quite sure, but hey, whatever the case may be, this is what's available now. Now, the original copy, I've seen first editions on eBay and the like, and they're not too expensive. But the thing about this re-release is that if you go to the author's website of Immerland, IMMERLAND.com, he actually has a link there of a free ebook.
Oh.
So he'd give it away through Book Funnel. And for anyone who's used it, it's pretty straightforward. But anyone who has not used it, you just go, you click on get my book, you enter in your first name, your email address, push send, and then you're sent a link to be able to get that book in that way. And so that can be a more cost-effective way, especially for homeschooling families. Oy vey. Just cost in general can get a bit much for homeschooling families. But there is an audio version that's out there. There is an audio book. As I believe, I actually have not looked into the audiobook. I'll be very honest with you on that one. But I do know for certain that it is on Audible.
Okay.
So folks can get it through that. And it's actually narrated by the author himself.
Oh, excellent.
And so that was part of the re-release in 2022. Now, as I said, this is part of the Tessalindrio. Well, it's part of the series called The Portals of Tessalindrio. So this is book one. The second book is known as Lonama's Map, I believe is how he has the character's name pronounced. And so there is at least 3 books that I know of in the trilogy. I don't know if he's added any more as of late, but he does have other books, other things to read, and he has his own pressing now of Karanath Press is what he's publishing with.
Okay.
And just doing a quick glance, actually, he has added quite a bit to this series. He has added a total of 5 books. So there's 5 books in this series.
Which enables him to give away the first one. Yeah. The first one's always free.
Yep, exactly. So, go check it out. It's at least worth reading once, especially for those teenagers who just want to be able to read something like this. So excellent. This would be a great option for you.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you for sharing it with us. Like you said, probably an author or a series we might not otherwise be familiar with. So we appreciate your knowledge and expertise as always. So that's it for today. Join us again next time here on Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast for more book recommendations, conversation about different genres, etc. We appreciate that you tuned in today and look for the next one. Until then, keep reading, keep listening.